All right. Welcome, everyone. The bells outside of my window tell me that it is time for us to begin. We do have a wonderful panel today, and I want to make sure that there is enough time for everyone. My name is Amy Krupel, and I'm the director of the UF Center for European Studies. The UF Center for European Studies is a Jean Monnet Center of Excellence and part of the JM in the US network of JM centers and other Erasmus Plus funded programs. A few housekeeping notes before we begin. Today's discussion will be recorded and available on the UFCES website. We will have a Q&A session following the presentations, and participants can submit questions through the Q&A button on the bottom of your screens. Today, you are all joining us to discuss EU policy on digitization of art collections, and this panel and the virtual series that it is part of are supported by the EU Erasmus Plus Jean Monnet program. This discussion is part of our center's series on the EU cultural policy beyond masters in museums, which explores the history, politics, and implementation of EU cultural policy, examining issues such as cultural heritage, protection, participation and inclusion in EU cultural heritage, and global heritage and EU foreign policy. For details on the other upcoming panels in this series, please visit ces.ufl.edu. Our panel today includes three panelists. We are happy to welcome Dr. Antoinette Magé-Dominici, professor at the Institute of Art History at the Ludwig Maximilians University, where she works on the value of cultural objects and provenance research. Dr. Ewa Manikowska, who is an associate professor at the Institute of Art at the Polish Academy of Sciences and principal investigator of the Polish research team for the EU Digital Heritage and Cultural Conflicts DG Conflict project. And as well, Dr. Arianna Travaglia, who is coordinator for the Center for Cultural Heritage Technology at the Italian Institute of Technology, where her work is placed at the intersection of technology and humanities and the inclusion of digital practices within the study and management of cultural heritage. We are also very lucky to have our moderator today, Dr. Francesca Fiorentini, who is one of our core faculty for the JMC seminar this year. She is one of the leading scholars on cultural policy, an associate professor of comparative private law at the University of Trieste, and co-editor of Cultural Heritage in the European Union, a critical inquiry into law and policy. And with that, I will hand it over to Dr. Fiorentini to introduce the panel and get everything started.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Kreple. Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us. I want to thank again all the staff of the Jean Monnet Center of Excellence of the University of Florida, and of course, Amy, for inviting me to be the moderator of this wonderful panel. And also I wish to thank our three lady panelists for joining us today. Let me just briefly introduce the topic of our panel in a very general way. Well, we know that digital technologies and the internet are radically transforming our perceptions and the uses of cultural heritage within societies. With virtual reality, artificial intelligence, 3D modeling, and also geomatics as applied to cultural heritage can create unprecedented opportunities of public access to cultural heritage, and at the same time represent the kind of new frontier for institutions and for policymakers at all levels, global, regional, national. Thanks to technology, policymakers can now engage in new cultural and business opportunities by reaching out new users and developing new contexts for a variety of purposes like leisure or education. Yet this is not happening without problems. Institutions and policymakers still tend to operate under the rule of path dependence in a conceptual and legal context designed in a pre-digital era, conceived for the classical heritage, the analog heritage, made of tangible, movable, and immovable assets deemed to be preserved and restored in a function which was basically oriented to education. Then this is a rather static approach to cultural heritage. Now, and thanks to digitization, the paradigm is rapidly shifting to a global dimension. where all the new forms of cultural assets are mixed in a perspective which is certainly strongly economically oriented, but has also the potential to enhance access to cultural heritage and to enhance democratization of culture, whatever it means, with its potential and risks. Yet, this new approach must be accompanied by a reconceptualization of the basic issues pertaining to cultural heritage law, practice, and policy. Among these issues lies, for instance, the issue of the definition. What actually is digital heritage? How can we make a difference between digital heritage and traditional heritage? And how can we design a proper legal regime for digital heritage? And how can we design a proper policy strategy for these new forms of heritage? Well, the panel will proceed as follows. Exactly the issue of definitions is at the center of our first presentation by Antoinette Maget-Dominicet. Antoinette, thank you for joining us. You have been already introduced by Dr. Kreppel, and I leave the floor to you. Thank you very much.
Yes. First, thank you for the invitation to participate to this workshop. It's a real pleasure of being there somewhere in the digital world, and I'm quite thrilled about the upcoming discussion at the end of our presentation. I have been asked to give you an overview of the questions arising around the definition of digital heritage in general and digital cultural heritage in particular. The issues that I'm about to address have benefited immensely from discussions and prior works led with Dario Hawkes, currently based as a postdoc in Lucerne and Basel, and my student assistant Elisa Ludwig in Munich, who also assisted me by preparing the slides for today's talk. Thanks to both of you. The definition of heritage, the use of the concept and its derivative cultural heritage, as well as its contextualizations, have been used to be a topic being vividly discussed in many disciplines. Yet, the most significant change over the last 40 years resides in the temporal, spatial, and contextual extension of its comprehension. A recent history of the definition and conceptualization of cultural heritage is equivalent with an history of progressive dematerialization from buildings to intangible resources. More and more categories of objects are considered as heritage, and the expression itself is being questioned, as well as the reduction of temporalities. Reason here for, in fact, that objects are collected by memory institutions soon after their production. Think, for example, of some design objects or internet art. I will come to that later. Currently, one challenging step concerns the recognition of digital heritage, whose primacy nowadays trumps the complexity of its delineation, its preservation, and its access, as addressed by Francesca in her introduction. In the context of the pandemic that we are currently experiencing, digital technologies have become dominant normality. We are working, we are meeting, thinking, creating digitally. In doing so, we are using digitized resources and creating new ones. This process is based on a duality between the material and the immaterial, which continues in the digital world and calls for many definitions. That will be the aim of my talk today. I will try to give you a definition of digital heritage, then address some points of further challenges, and finally highlight two main potentialities raised by the digital. When considering the development of computers, hardware, and informatics as software, different sets of supports and data have been compiled early in this history. Their preservation quickly became a major challenge. The evolution of media and drives and their compatibility proved to be asynchronous. From the field of cultural heritage, the libraries first draw attention to the loss of resources and the increase of data, which must be stored to the public authorities. Further, they referred to the upcoming disappearance of testimonies of human activities. Since libraries have early qualified these resources, this data as heritage, it was a logical consequence to continue the discussions within the framework of the UNESCO. Initiated 2001 after a decision of the 31st General Conference of the UNESCO, various stakeholders and representatives from member states worked on a draft charter to propose a new preservation instrument dedicated to the digital heritage. The schedule was kept, and at the next General Conference in 2003, a charter was adopted. One important aspect to note here is that the protection of digital heritage is situated from the first discussions on the topic within the organization, communication and information sector, and not the cultural one. That means that the discussion on the preservation of digital heritage is conducted under UNESCO's mandate of promoting the free flow of ideas by words and images. The UNESCO General Conference adopted the Charter on the Preservation of Digital Heritage in 2003. There is a lot of interesting aspects in this charter, although it remains on a low level within the UNESCO norm system. As a result, it gained a discrete recognition. In a sense reinforced by further texts and programs, such as the 2015 recommendation concerning the preservation of and access to documentary heritage, including in digital form, or the Memory of the World program, this charter remains intricately linked to documentary aspects, but still challenges other heritage sectors. The text gathers a definition of digital heritage and its access in part 1, as well as identified traits in part 2, responses and responsibilities in part 3 and 4. It offers a theoretical framework for the delimitation and interpretation of the digital heritage, as well as a common ground for any further discussions. The Charter defines in Article 1 digital heritage as a quote, you have that on your screen, unique resources of human knowledge and expression, such as cultural, educational, scientific, and administrative resources, as well as technical, legal, medical, and other kinds of information. These may have been digitally created or digitalized, and by doing so, the Charter introduced the existing duality between digital born and analog born. Article 1, paragraph 2 offers a listing of formats, letting it open, you have that in a second paragraph, and raises attention to short-term durability as well as technical challenges. Finally, in the third paragraph, the notion of value for the mankind is introduced, as these resources have lasting value and significance, even if not scaling this as outstanding, as known from other UNESCO texts related to heritage. One may also identify a strong will to consider this heritage as inclusive, as it may exist in any language, in any part of the world, and in any area of human knowledge or expression. If it's really a democratization, as quoted by Francesca in her introduction, I'm not sure, and I would be happy to discuss it further. There is a definition there of a complex and in some way banal heritage, not being specifically defined and missing its material component. There is no definition of a digital cultural heritage or even of a real digital human heritage. The Charter further introduced notions of access, selection, preservation, and responsibilities in quite a new way, comparing with prior recommendations and conventions within UNESCO. There is indeed a stronger commitment to diversity and cooperation with public and private actors. When considering the preamble of the Charter on the Preservation of Digital Heritage and its statutory provisions, it becomes clear how digital heritage challenges classical heritage concepts. At the same time, the definitions proposed by the UNESCO, used in practice and in theory, are challenged, in my opinion, by 5 main aspects. The material duality of the digital heritage has been impressively addressed. A parallel with a more classical field of heritage may be enlightened, since the preservation of the medium is essential for the maintenance of the message. The rediscovery of cuneiform writing, for example, in modern times, was based on clay tablets, the preservation of which in memory institutions requires precise humidity levels to maintain readability. In the same way, the conservation and presentation of hard and softwares in a memory institution requires maintenance and emulation in order to still work. Secondly, not addressing further the duality between information and support, such as in the case of digital heritage, raised critics linked with the digital colonialism, and without going really further on that, a glimpse on a map presenting the repartition of servers over the globe is worth 1,000 words. Just think of the concept of access and democratization raised by the UNESCO and concerning these material infrastructures. The same access may also be limited by intellectual property concerns. The Charter underlines how member states have to consider this further problematic within their internal legislation, and if many resources are accessible under collaborative licensing, the thin temporal frontier between raw digital resources and digital heritage led to still unmovable difficulties to guarantee access. Then the definition best assets are their broadness, and at the same time, this may be qualified as their weakness. Digital heritage may cover almost all and nothing. Digital cultural heritage remains mostly undefined. Some authors speak of an institutionalized culture of practices and ideas, others of installations disrupting safe art history, but also as an aid to the storage of artifacts and to save them for the future. You have no creating dimension by this. There is no binding definition, and a strong influence by the materialist epistemology is still to be ridden. This situation may again lead to exclusion or ranking within the digital cultural heritage, opening the way to a strong differentiation between low and high culture. One thinks, of course, of the discrepancy of digital art or digitally run scientific exhibitions as human creation and knowledge, and cats' pictures on social media as human expression and mass production. Does only the artwork or the exhibition be qualified as digital cultural heritage when the cat's pictures are only digital heritage? This partition particularly challenges each selection for preservation, what should be harvested, after which criteria, and which search for representativity. Who should be responsible of the selection? Finally, this partition between digital and digital cultural heritage may be further challenged by the multiplicity of data linked to one singular cultural object. Taking, for example, one painting kept in one museum, like the Night Watch of Rembrandt in Amsterdam, you have the physical object, the data set comprising the digitalization of the painting and all further documentation related to this, as well as finally the use of the data and the production of new resources. The complexity may be addressed through the qualification of digital born and digitized analog born, but it is also a definition which is influenced by our past consideration of heritage. When considering, for example, contemporary illegal trafficking of archaeological objects, one regularly only has an object being offered for sale on social media, not being further documented and only digitally reproduced without any prior possibilities to come back to the material object. In a sense, some analog-born objects are existing almost only through its digital-born documentation, and this is long not being harvested to be kept for further generations of curators or of scientists. It states out of the discussion that digital is part of our lives, and the forced impulse given by the COVID-19 pandemic highlighted our need to preserve the digital heritage and heritage in continuously growing and raising many challenges, as well as offering opportunities. And I would like to give a short perspective by quoting two aspects. Artists first have long recognized the potentiality offered by the digital, and many developed now purely digital-based art. Parallel to the definition of digital heritage, there is here an interesting aspect, as artists and institutions are developing in a way concomitantly new works and new procedures of acquisition and preservation in a parallel dynamic unknown by now. The kind of chronological dichotomy between the time of the production of a painting for a specific building, for example, and its latest collecting by an art museum reflects in the acquisition procedure. For example, the House of Electronic Arts in Basel facilitates pioneering perspectives and original forms of expression in contemporary arts and collects successfully and conserve works of media art. The curators there develop in cooperation with artists a proper documentation scheme in order to address aspects like obsolescence and integration. The second and the last aspect, I'm coming to my end, I would quote here, is the contribution of digitalization to the post-colonial discussion on the place of keeping certain analog-born objects, even if the critique concerning material infrastructures and access remain present. Quite well known within the north of the globe, one may think here of the reconstitution of the Bibliotheca Palatina as hundreds of years after its dissemination between Protestants and Catholics during the 30-year war, during the first half of the 17th century. All manuscripts have been digitalized and reunified on a website page. Its opening to the global south raises many questions. Benedict Savoy and Felwine Sarr dedicated one page of their 150 pages long report written in 2018 for the French President Emmanuel Macron. Andrea Vallas and Mathilde Pavis worked on an answer to the report and introduced a new voice in the discussion. Signed by almost 150 scholars, this answer builds on a strong qualification of digital objects and enlightens the discrepancy existing in the access and comprehension of the digital. Building on this, Lukas Liksinski published last month an article on this topic, letting many questions unanswered and opening further ones. To conclude, one may consider that UNESCO gave 2003 a supranational visibility to a topic raising many questions, challenges, and opportunities, obliging to think new about heritage and heritagization, as well as establish inequalities in infrastructures, and hopefully paving the way to a better repartition of resources. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Antoniette. Really interesting and important, this initial presentation, setting up some basic concepts and potential and debatable issue in this area. And let's now move to the second step, which is also very important. Let's give a closer look to the technology we have and we can use and apply to cultural heritage with Dr. Arianna Traviglia. Thank you, Arianna, for joining us. You have the floor now. 15 minutes as we planned. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you very much also from my side for your kind invitation. It is really a pleasure to be here in such a good company and discuss about the digitization of cultural heritage. So I would like to start telling you something about what happened a couple of years ago. It was April the 9th. On that day, during the third digital day organized by the European Commission in Brussels, 27 European countries have signed a declaration of cooperation on cultural heritage. And this document was very important because it committed the signatories to work closer together for the first time, to increase the use of the state-of-the-art technologies that we have by now available in order to record and analyze the Europe's rich cultural heritage and to promote it by improving its visibility, and also, and this is very important as well, to generate spillovers in other sectors. So they have started to put forward this idea of cultural heritage being also something that can increase the economy of the European Union. So the signing of this declaration represented in a sense a milestone in the commitment of the European Union member states, because for the first time they were really stating that they would work to increase the capability of making culture and heritage more accessible and more reachable for the European citizens and clearly the global citizens, and also to sponsor new ways of enjoying this cultural content. And this came at the end of a decade in which the European Union had proactively promoted digitization and digital preservation of cultural heritage and invested quite a number of resources and funds also to facilitate access to the generated digital resources for their analysis and for their reuse. And in this period, some major projects were funded, some of which we will hear about today from the other speakers, like, for example, Europeana. And although they were all related to digitization of cultural heritage, each of them had different content, different objectives. And they were the important thing of the fact that this signing of the declaration was set into the digital day of which is an annual celebration, let's say, that the European Union has, during which they normally it has been set up basically a few years ago to improve the capacity of the European Union member states to accelerate the digital development in key areas. And the fact that they have added at that point cultural heritage was during the Digital Day celebration showed very clearly for the first time what was the relevance of cultural heritage within the European context. The declaration of cooperation was signed to promote specifically the acceleration of the digital recording of cultural heritage, recognizing the importance and the pivotal role of the digital recording of cultural heritage as a first step of any other further use and reuse of digital data. However, it is important, in my opinion, to clarify that the domain of digital cultural heritage is not only about digitizing intended as digital recording, but it is a lot more than that. And this is what I'm trying to explain to you today. And that has also to do with the broadness of the term of cultural heritage, as we have heard in the previous presentation. So this brings us to consider what is the digital heritage. And in simple terms, this is the presentation of somebody else today, so I will not go through this, but in simple terms, cultural heritage is the heritage that we have inherited from those that have preceded us. And it's physical places, it's monuments, it's objects, but it's also beliefs and practices and tradition, and it's so much more than that. So cultural heritage can be a painting, can be an ancient monument, can be a bronze statue, can be a ceramic jar, but can be also the capacity of recreating or weaving fabrics like it was done in the past. And from this broadness of the term cultural heritage, it is sense that different type of digital approaches also are needed to digitally record, preserve, use and reuse cultural heritage data. And it's also important to stress the difference that exists between the two terms, digitization and digitalization, because the terms are very often used as if they were one, but they are actually not. And I would like to go through these to explain better what I mean. Digitization is the process of turning the analog into the digital. So the digitization of cultural heritage means transferring the physical shape and aspect, the characteristics of objects and monuments and sites into the digital world, and also to transfer the existing amount of knowledge that we have about this cultural heritage to a digital format. Empirically, this means that we can record in 2D or 3D the physical shape of cultural heritage assets, be them objects or monuments or sites. We can record metadata, which is the data about the digital data that have to stay together with what we digitize, with the cultural heritage assets we digitize. And it's also to record in digital format information that is not normally visible to human eye, and that is related to cultural heritage. And then we can use all this data that we have recorded to generate new knowledge. And this exactly further step of digital data use and reuse is what is called digitalization. So let's look now together at some of the most popular ways, popular forms of digitization and digitalization. So one of the most famous and you have seen certainly many occasions is the 3D digitization. And we have now technologies that enable us to record in 3D portable objects and monuments. And what is the advantage of doing it? Why are we doing that? But first of all, we obtain a digital twin, a so-called digital twin, a digital copy of cultural heritage object, which we have then for preserving it across time in its shape and its characteristics. And this is very important. And because it enables the second reason for which it is important to have a 3D of a cultural heritage objects, because by digitizing an item or a structure or a site, we can visualize the object at a scale that is not normally possible, at a level of accuracy that we cannot regularly approach. And we can also access a number of information that sometimes are not even visible to naked eye, and that enable us to study and better analyze the object itself. The third reason why this is important is that if the object gets stolen or damaged or destroyed or degraded, we still have this digital 3D so-called simulacra. So let me be clear about this. It's not like having the 3D of an object is like to have still the object as before, but at least we have the data, the digital data that can enable us to keep studying this object, and at least in part, and we can keep extracting meaningful information from these objects, even if this object is no more available, and we can even reproduce this in 3D printing when useful. So it is extremely important to go through this process. And the technological efforts of increasing the speed of digitization are also growing, because there has been a clear sense that with the huge number of cultural heritage assets we have, it's not possible anymore to proceed in a manual way as we are doing nowadays. So there is really an effort in this moment to try to realize in a faster way, more efficient way, more digitization of cultural heritage by automating processes of 3D scanning. So we are now starting to see the use of technical supports like robots to automate the process of the scanning, or other form of automation that enable us to digitize much faster than before. And this works even on a large scale, even when we look at digitizing large buildings or large monuments, we have now available technologies that can support the automation of the process. Drones are by now now familiar to all of us, and they are being used now together coupled with high precision cameras and other sensors to record not only the geometry, the 3D geometry of a site, of a monument, but also to map the characteristics of a conservation of this asset that cannot be seen by eye. So like humidity, heating, mold, all data that can highly support the preservation of such sites. But together with the 3D digitization, we have also the digital recording in 2 dimensions. For example, what is being done for scanning documents that apparently, at least, do not have a 3rd dimension. If you think about it, even something that is a page has a 3rd dimension. Is very, very subtle, but there is a 3rd dimension that is given by the inks or the colors that have been used to decorate manuscripts and maps on other type of documents. Also in this case, we have a huge amount of documents and maps and other different types of manuscript and printed also books that have to be digitized. And the number is so big that we are also looking at finding new ways to approach it in a faster way, all this process of digitization. And this is what is called the massive digitization. It's quite an easy to grasp concept that doesn't require much an explanation. It means clearly the digitization of large volumes of documents and maps. This process also is being automated as much as possible to complete this task of digitizing before the formats in which the first items have been digitized becomes obsolete. So we really need to accelerate the process and to look at the longevity of the data that we are collecting. And so we need to go beyond the regular manual pipeline of digitization to streamline the process. And then we have also other ways to record the digitally cultural heritage through technologies that enable us to get into the material component of these objects. We have instruments like hyperspectral imaging that enable us to see more than what our eyes can see using, for example, the infrared bands. And this provides an enhanced means of digitizing cultural heritage, enabling us to see also tiny little details that cannot be seen by eyes. So, for example, like the signature of a painter under the paint that has been covered by paint and put over the painting years after, for example, the creation of the masterpiece. And these are, these type of technology are extremely important, especially for very fragile items, very fragile cultural heritage. Let's think about, for example, the Dead Sea Scrolls or the Scrolls of Ercolano. And these technologies enable us to see, without ruining these objects, they enable us to see a lot more that we could normally see with a regular type of analysis. And then we have another type of recording, the digital technologies that enable us to identify from remote something that sometimes from very long distances, cultural heritage sites that are still unknown because are still, subsoil, still underground, they're still covered by the soil. We have special sensors mounted on airplanes and satellites that enable us to record digital images that can be then further processed to identify archaeological sites underground. This is made possible because the images enable us to detect the subtle traces on soil and vegetation that might be referred to subsoil archaeological deposits. And the soil and the vegetation basically act as markers of archaeological deposits that are still underground. Why can we see this type of traces? Well, the phenomenon is quite simple, is well known to archaeologists. Basically, vegetation growing on top of archaeological structure will have access to less soil, and so it will grow up more stressed and will grow less than the surrounding vegetation and will go yellow earlier than the surrounding crops. And on the contrary, the vegetation that is growing on top of, for example, of a ditch will have access to more rich terrains and will grow stronger and greener. And these traces over bare soil, we can also see these marks because, for example, when the soil is being plowed, the structures that are being broken from the work of the plow are brought up on the surface, and these can be detected, these little fragments of cultural heritage sites that are underneath can be seen from the images taken from above. So we have also this type of ways of recording cultural heritage that we don't even know it exists. So as you can see, it's a really huge amount of data that we can collect using digital technologies. And the challenge, therefore, of digitization is less in the, let's say, in the reception of digital data, and more in knowing what to do with that, what to do with this data. And this is where the digitalization comes into the picture. The digitalization takes the form of connecting, processing, and reacting to data. Basically, once we have so many data, we have to do something with them. And this digital data can be used to analyze further cultural heritage, to expand the type of research that can be done, and to extract new meaningful knowledge from them. And there are now many ways that help us to do that, to facilitate our work and make it much faster and a lot more precise. And one of them is certainly one of the most important at this point is certainly artificial intelligence. So artificial intelligence, now we can use it for many different things. But for example, is being used to decipher and transliterate ancient languages and to understand the meaning of other signs that are, for example, inscribed in inscriptions, and for which archaeologists are not being able yet to understand their meaning. Using artificial intelligence, we can analyze thousands, for example, of tablets, like cuneiform tablets, like the ones you are seeing right now, and understand phenomena that we could not understand with our traditional type of research. Like in this example, you can see those tiny little holes within a cuneiform tablet. The meaning, the reason why those holes are there is still unknown. What we are doing, for example, now with the artificial intelligence is to try to understand the context and understand what those holes means in the context of a cuneiform tablet. But there is a lot more. There is the capacity of transcribing text, like we were speaking before about digitizing manuscripts. Now we have the ability through artificial intelligence to transcribe handwritten text. It's a little bit like when you use OCR, optic recognition of characters, after you have done a scanning of a regular document. This is the same thing that we are trying to do with artificial intelligence. So take this text and transcribe them in a format that can be digital, and for that reason can be further reused to extract content and information. And then artificial intelligence can be used also to automate the recognition of cultural heritage objects. For example, artificial intelligence is being trained to recognize thousands of ancient coins, and artificial intelligence can then be used to automatically identify a new coin for which, for example, there is no attribution, or can support a numismatician to recognize a very corroded coin that cannot be read as normally done. In the future, we will have also probably the opportunity to be able to recognize a fake coin from a real one using the potential of artificial intelligence. And there is also a new sector of artificial intelligence for cultural heritage that is very useful because it can detect real art items and fake ones. And the technology is now so mature that there are apps that are being commercialized and offered to museums and galleries in order for patrons to check their artwork. And this is not taking away the job of experts, but actually supporting the work of the expert and complement the traditional methods, making even easier the process of recognizing fakes. And even in the field I was mentioning before, the one of recognition of cultural heritage site still under the soil. There are now a number of platforms like Copernicus, we have it in Europe, is a European Space Agency platform, or Google Engine that is connected to Google Earth that you probably know. They provide access to a huge number of images for free, images from satellite that can be used for several different goals. And these are the so-called big data from the space. Their quantity is by now so large that is no more possible for operators of cultural heritage to visually observe them on screen singularly. So these technologies of artificial intelligence are supporting operators to process all the thousands and thousands of images and look in them to look for these features that can be connected to the presence of archaeological sites still underground. And not only that, they can be used also for something extremely useful, which is to help law enforcement agencies to detect archaeological sites that are being looted. So this brings also, a new level of capacity in terms of protecting cultural heritage. So as you have seen, the digitization, the concept, the practice of digitization is turning Europe's cultural resources into a important building block for the European digital economy. And it provides also the European cultural and creative industries with a competitive edge. And the digitization and the online accessibility of cultural resources can really fuel innovation in the European area and can support other fields like education, architecture, publishing, design, even gaming. So all the capacity of digitize and access the cultural heritage also promotes the collections of museums, promotes the libraries, promotes the archives that have in this way much greater visibility. And this not only attracts tourists and researchers, but also business for regional economies. So they are becoming basically digitalization and digital preservation can really create employment opportunities in areas such as the 3D capturing and the 3D processing, and therefore they can promote an economic growth and employment opportunity. And this is exactly the reason why cultural heritage is being given from the European Union so many support, so much support. That's why European Union is committing a lot of financial and human resources. But this all comes to one important thing that I would like to stress after speaking about the digitization so much, which is that this is being done for a very, very important reason, that cultural heritage is an important part of what we are and what we identify with. And this is the real and most profound of the reason why Europe is doing it and should continue to do. Thank you.
Thank you, Oriana. Thank you very much. Extremely interesting for all of us. But now I will pass immediately the floor to Eva Manikowska in order not to lose time and to have time for our debate. Thank you, Eva. The floor is yours. EU cultural
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
I'll just put my presentation on.
Yes,
a second.
of course.
Okay, thank you very much for the invitation, and I'm passing straight away to the presentation. Well, I will propose you a move backwards, really backwards, because to understand why the European policy towards cultural heritage, the most consistent European policy towards European Union policy towards cultural heritage is and the most money consuming and the most grounded one is connected with digitization, we must go back in time to the times when words such as digitization, internet, globalization, computer were still not in our everyday use and were being shaped. So digital was connected with fingers, not really with with what we are understanding it right now. So let's just remember and remind that in the 40s and 50s, the first computers were invented. In the 1950s, computer science emerged as a discipline. And from that time on, in America, in Europe, and in other parts of the world, efforts were taken to to use and toward inventions that would, let's say, make possible the use of these new tools, and especially the connection between two computers and the build of so-called digital networks. And this everything, let's say that this important era is 80s and 90s. So in 1985, we have the first www page, symbolic SCOM. In 1990, the first email sent, and I don't know if you remember, but I remember as computers entered into my university. I remember university without computers. So we are going through a really civilizational change. And all this is happening at the time when European integration is taking place. And on the slide, you can see, I just put on the left, like what is changing and how the notion of European information society is entering into European policy and the important moments of European integration. So in 1979, the first concept of European Information Society was expressed at the Dublin European Council. So it is a society in which scientific and intellectual activity of all kinds, economic transactions, and the whole path of daily life is based on a network of information. And in the same year, the European Currency Unity was introduced. So it's happening at the same time. This path-breaking document which shapes the European policy and the information technology, the role of information technology according to it, are the Delors White Paper on Growth, Competitiveness and Employment, which was issued just a year after the signing of the Maastricht Treaty, and which was really addressed at addressing the European depression, economic depression at that time. And this is like the grounding document which introduced the single market idea. And among its postulates was the building of a pan-European information infrastructure. And afterwards, the Directorate General of Information of Society and Media was established in the structure of the EU. And soon afterwards, and this was in the plan, in the framework of the Lisbon Action to make Europe a really competitive economically and knowledge-based. And it was always on the backdrop of the United States, that was happening in Japan. And finally, in 2002, this Europe Action Plan was introduced. No heritage in it, but this is very important to understand in what framework heritage comes in. And just to show you that we are talking of 79, so still the European Union was not as we know it today. Still, it was before the big enlargements. What is very important in this connection of digitization, information technology, and European policy is that the digital networks mean the commodification of information. So this economization, what also Arianna was saying, this for us it's like normal. Okay, cultural heritage is a sector. We are talking about an economic quality, but this was new at that time. This is like a quote from a discussion in the European Parliament in the 2000s. The European model of information society must be driven by democratic, social, cultural, and educational concerns, and not dominated by economic and political interests. And who starts? Where does this digitization of cultural heritage start? So the libraries mark the trial. And it's very important because it's like an initiative, not an EU initiative, but initiative of a conference of European national librarians, which is a body of national libraries connecting all the national libraries of the countries of the Council of Europe. And it was founded in 1987. And just let's remember that national libraries are like the national depositories of information, the main national depositories of information. And among these ideas of participation and collaboration was the issue of how to use information technologies in the libraries. And you can see here a poster from a conference organized by the CNLE, when you see this old-time computer and the books and how to join it together. Like the credo of the CENL is we are Europe's national libraries working together to preserve the continent's cultural heritage. And it is thanks to the initiative of this body that in one of the first European strategic programs on research and information technology, ESPRIT, an action plan for libraries was introduced. And what is also important, but the first initiative was the creation of Gabriel in 1998. And just to show you that Gabriel is from the name of Gabriel Nanderus, which is an important librarian of Cardinal Mazarin, and he wrote a book about library classification and how to form a library. So it's always like you have all this tradition. So European tradition behind. So Gabriel was generally about a network of how to introduce computer into libraries and about, let's say, catalogs, how to make the catalogs of European national libraries. So no digitization yet, but how to use the tools, how to introduce the tools, how to introduce technology. First, you have to introduce technology, and then you can think what to do with it. And like the next important step is the concept of a European library in 2005. And this was, let's say, now it becomes European, it becomes like EU, it becomes also political. In 2005, Jacques Chirac and 5 EU prime ministers of 5 EU member states wrote to the president of the European Commission, it was Barroso at the time, the so-called letter, digitization letter, urging to start like a program of digitizing libraries. The heritage of European libraries is unequaled in richness and diversity, but if it is not digitized and made accessible online, this heritage could tomorrow not feel its just place in the future geography of knowledge. And this was just urged by a manifesto of the director of the National Library, of the French National Library, who just started this idea, which then was put into such a letter. And what is very important, we are in 2005, so it's just after the EU big enlargement. And among the signatories of this letter, we have the Prime Minister of Germany, of Italy, of Spain, but also of Poland and Hungary. And I'm showing here like a picture of the Biblioteca Nazionale Marciana, as our host, one of our hosts is from Trieste, just to show you like the importance, one of the first public libraries in Europe and why libraries are so important. So this letter was, as I said already, was initiated by an idea of a director of a French National Library, who really looked at the Google Book project, who launched in 2004 to digitalize and made available online 10 million books from mainly American libraries and the Oxford Library. So it was like an issue of competition. Europe cannot be behind, like exactly what is all about the policy, the European policy based on information society. And after this all went very fast. Already in October 2005, Viviane Reding, so she is the European Commissioner for Information Society and Media at the time, announces an I-2010 initiative on digital libraries. I-2010 is another action program on dealing with information technologies in Europe. In beginning of 2006, the launch of a work of high-level expert group to work how to do it they start. And in August 2006, we have the first Commission recommendation on digitization and online accessibility of cultural material and online preservation. And what is very important, it's not only about libraries at this moment. It's all about like European cultural heritage, the cultural heritage that is in the European member institutions. And from the idea of this European digital library, like the European Digital Library Network was born because the idea was, okay, so we have this digitalized material, but we have to put it on in one place, and who will manage it? And in 2008, the Europeana Foundation was founded. This is a foundation sponsored by the European Commission based in the Netherlands. The Europeana Foundation this is like from its mission statements, to make Europe's cultural and scientific heritage available through a cross-domain portal, the Europeana EU, to work with museums, archives, audiovisual archives, and libraries to deliver the portal and make it sustainable, to bring items that have already been digitalized into the portal, to encourage and support the digitization of more of Europe's cultural and scientific heritage. In 2011, this like another stage was a report of another important reflection group of a Comité des Sages on bringing Europe's cultural heritage online. So how to make this 2006 recommendation work. And what is very important, just to look who was in this committee. So Elisabeth Nigman, the director of the German National Library, Maurice Levy, the chairman of the supervisory board of Publics Group. This is the world's largest advertising and publication group. And Jacques de Decker, a Belgian writer. So you have like both like heritage institutions, we have like the business, and we have like a writer, and they published this report called The New Renaissance. So just like before we had Gabriel, so now we have the New Renaissance, and in Europe almost everything is called always Renaissance, with postulates which at the end were put in another recommendation, the Commission recommendation of the 27th of October 2011 on the digitization and online accessibility of cultural material and digital preservation. So what this recommendation urges is for public funding for institutions to digitize cultural material and provide its free accessibility. It urged member states to give such public funding. And what is very important, it was evaluated that such an action would cost over 105 billion euro. To put public domain masterpieces should be incorporated into Europeana by 2016. Member states should notably increase funding for digitization. It urged collaboration between public and private sectors, and what is also very important, solutions for making works covered by copyright available online, to work for such solutions. And so how this Europeana works and how this European policy works. So it's like all the states participate, member states participate in it. When digitization projects are taking place, sometimes they are covered, like they are managed by so-called national aggregators. That is like small national Europeanas, which collect digital material from other institutions and coordinate this work, and this goes to Europeana. Then you have regional aggregators, then thematic collections. It's an idea of Europeana which launches some ideas. Okay, let's do a collection about for example Foundation painting, or now there's about LGBTQ culture in Europe. And it's not only about museum, as I said, but also it's not only about libraries, but also audiovisual collection. And these collections are managed by the European Film Gateway Archives, which have their own archive portal of Europe Foundation, and the European Library. And all this ends up in the Europeana, giving like a showcase of the European heritage online. And okay, so what like one of the role of this of Europeana and of this policy of digitization is the creation of a kind of common heritage. And how does it work? So Europeana from time to time launches some common ideas. And one of such projects is the Europeana 280, which brought together a collection of more than 500 our inspiring paintings, drawings, photographs, posters, illustrations, and other objects, chosen by each state. So your best masterpieces, 10 highlights for 28 countries, and put together in one space, virtual space. So it's like a patchwork of national masterpieces. And now, because it's a short presentation, we started with the past, and now we go to the future. So how will this go on? One can be sure that digitization of cultural heritage will still play a very and a growing important role in the policy, European policy towards cultural heritage. I'm putting here, we have here just a quote from the new strategy of Europeana 2020-2025. And we can see how the language has changed from the time when it started. The vision for Europeana imagines a cultural heritage sector. So already we have a sector, it's clear, it's sure, powered by digital, and a Europe powered by culture. So a heritage sector powered by digital and Europe powered by culture, giving it a resilient, growing economy, increased employment, improved well-being, and a sense of European identity. So between this economic and identitarian tool, and it's so respect for core values. Public expectations, so we are looking what the public really wants, how to interact with it. So it's the growing role of social media, of interaction, market forces, so more collaboration with Google, with Apple, with different companies, technological innovation, what Ariana was saying. So in 2019, in the Declaration of Cooperation, one of the points is the advancement, is a pan-European initiative for free digital digital scanning of cultural heritage. And a global perspective. So what Francesca said, we are now in a really more globalized world, and this is this is really becoming more and more important. However, and this is, I think I quite like this graph with this person in front of the museum with question mark surrounded by this four strategies: market forces, public expectation, global perspective, and technological innovation. And we can ask, you just can ask at the end if almost uncritical belief in digitization and digitization of cultural heritage is the right way to go. And I looked through a survey launched by the Europeana on the global pandemic and on where to go. It was addressed to many stakeholders, to people involved in digitization, to institutions, and so on. Well, let's say the question was quite stupid, but one of the questions is, what would you change? What would you expect? And really, everybody expected to go on and digitize forever. There was one issue. Okay, let's do something with digital heritage. It's not. It's becoming important. There's nothing about it in the European policy. There was one about 3D, and there was neither one about what this tells us about Europe at the end. What are we doing? How are we shaping the European heritage and the idea of European heritage in face of what is happening? It's not only the global pandemic, but it's also the rise of this nationalism in Europe, the economic crisis, which soon will have a question, isn't it too expensive? So at the end, I don't know if we are not going toward a wall, but this is like an open question.
Thank you, Eva. Thank you very much. It was very interesting. I'm sorry that we had to concentrate your speeches, but I understand that the topic is so broad that it should have been a larger space. Okay, then we can move to our debate and to see whether we have questions. I recall that if you have questions, you can write them in the proper section in Zoom. We have already the first question written by Eslam Nofal and directed to Arianna. I read it and Arianna can answer so lively. He asks, from your interpretation about the difference between digitization and digitalization of cultural heritage, do you consider the communication of digital heritage knowledge to the generic public, such as VR, AR, tangible interfaces, and so on, is part of the digitalization? Or digitalization is only about how experts deal with data to generate new knowledge?
Okay. Okay, very good question. It's a very good question. Actually, I frankly did not have time to put in slides and comments on virtual reality, augmented and reality, because that would, require a 15 minutes of presentation by itself just to tell very few things. But yeah, definitely I see augmented reality and virtual reality in the side of digitalization. So it's using digital data, 3D data, to create something that is for communication. It doesn't have to be new knowledge, but it has to be something to do with showing data of cultural heritage in another way. And actually, I must say that very often virtual reality and augmented reality can be used to produce new knowledge, because very often, for example, in archaeology, this is the example I know best, you can have virtual environments that really enable you to understand better the use of space in antiquity, the use of light, and make you understand that maybe you did a reconstruction that is completely wrong because a certain room could not have worked in that way. So actually, although they are seen very often only as way of communicating something, like to make understand somebody that doesn't know much about archaeology how a room, a building, or an object would look like, they are not only that, they really enable people, experts, I mean, to really understand if their reconstructions have sense, if they are well done, if they have understood everything. So they are a way also to create a new knowledge. So definitely I put them into digitalization. I hope I answer your question.
Thank you very much, Arianna. We have another question that has been sent to Professor Kreppel, so I don't know who put the question, but it's for Eva. How will Brexit affect Europeana? I wonder if British institutions, museums and archives will still participate in the digital heritage collections of Europeana. Eva.
One moment. Yes, I don't know what are the agreements between British institutions and Europeana, but anyhow, in Europeana, also non-EU states are participating. So this is for first. Like for second, for sure, British institutions will continue digitizing their heritage. And anyhow, if you are looking for it, you usually don't go to Europeana, but you go to the site of a given museum. This is how it works. So I think it won't really affect. I think that collaborations will go on. Yeah.
Thank you, Eva. Do we have other questions, maybe from our students?
I think our students, as often happens in class, may be daunted from raising questions in this forum, although I expect we'll have them in class.
Maybe we give a few minutes for some other interested in putting a question.
We have a hand up.
I don't see the hand up.
Oren James, I'll allow him to talk.
Okay.
Hi, Yes. Good morning to everyone in America, and good evening to those of you in Europe. Thanks for this wonderful presentation. Now, I'm coming from a more scientific background, and it seems like throughout your presentation, this cultural heritage seems to have a humanities twist to it. And the reason I say that is because in the sciences, we're not facing the type of problems you're facing. Whenever we submit work for publication, there's certain guidelines set forth. We have to submit a digital copy. We have to submit it to only one journal, and a number of other criteria that must be met. The reason these criteria are so important is because of reproducibility. It's very important that once a scientific work is published, especially if it's lab work, it should be reproducible in another lab anywhere in the world. So it's been very tight on how to collect the data, and these papers are sent to a particular journal, and that journal keeps it on record pretty much forever. And that's all part of the training of a scientist. I'm wondering if there are any steps moving forward for those in the humanities, for those in the arts, if there are any protocols in place that they can use to make sure it stays digitized. So if their works are being put in a museum, does the museum have the responsibility of digitizing it and then sending it to these libraries you were talking about? In terms of America, one of the advantages I have in getting back to old heritage, that is the humanities, we have the Library of Congress, and more I'm seeing universities create their own special collections dealing with heritage. And then we're able to communicate with each university. So I'm actually not part of the University of Florida. I'm part of the University of Pittsburgh, but I heard about this through the University of Florida, and I can access material from all sorts of universities. So I'm wondering, moving forward, what does Europe have in place in particular for the individuals in the humanities and making sure that this stuff moving forward gets digitized properly and it's stored safely somewhere? Thank you.
Thank you for your question, and maybe who wants to answer among our panelists?
I think I will take the lead, and it's an interesting question, but because I work together. In my center, we work with people from hard sciences, like people from physics, chemistry, computer vision, machine learning, robotics. So I have to deal constantly with this difference between the humanities point of view and the scientist point of view. But the thing you are speaking about are really actually different in the sense that you, for example, analyze an object, whatever it is, a piece of metal or pottery or whatever, and you create your own data. You cannot do the same with cultural heritage, because cultural heritage is owned by a museum, and the collections of museum are not being created by having people going there, and if in very rare cases, and asking to digitize something, but they have to be done by the museum itself that promotes a campaign of digitization. And this has to do also with the copyright of the data, because even if you as a scholar go into the museum and do a scanning of a Roman statue, for example, you don't own those data at all. Those are still property of the museum. And so you can have some sort of agreement in case you want to reuse them for specific goals, but there is a very important problem, let's say. It's not a really problem, but there is this thing to consider, that who owns the data about cultural heritage. And there is a lot of discussion. I'm probably not the right person to speak about it, especially in this environment. I'm sure there are a lot of people that know the topic a lot better than me, but you cannot simply take the data and publish them without the permission of the museum or the gallery or the archive that is holding them. There has been a very strong, important case last year, actually, here in Europe, where the local archive of Venice has completely stopped the scanning from a university that had an agreement with them because they were not doing it in the way the archive thought that was the right way to do it. So the archive stopped, and they cannot even use the material that they had scanned, the materials they have scanned in the previous 5 years, because they don't own the rights on this cultural heritage. So this opens, you know, really different way of seeing at things. The cultural heritage is normally, at least in Italy, and this is the example I know better, in Italy, that everything is owned by the state. Cultural heritage is owned by the state. If you digitize that, the digitization, the 3D recording is owned by the state, meaning by the museum, and that means from the state. So everything is centralized. And if I go to digitize a statue, for example, I cannot use it. I cannot, you know, make posters to sell it without paying royalties to the state. So it is different than operating in the sciences, where you can analyze I don't know, a leaf or a piece of metal or other things, because nobody has a copyright to declare on those kind of things. I don't know, probably the other people connected that know a lot more than me about laws might be adding something about it.
If I may, I would just add perhaps that there is a time gap between what is doing to be published and to be created by now, and when working with objects from the past, and that there are some different possibilities to publish and to keep our research accessible and well kept in a digital way, and working on older collections not being digitalized or being digitalized, but with restriction to access to the data, as told by Arianna. Yeah, I think you have to consider this time gap in the process of digitalization and publication of research.
Okay, are there any other comments or open questions? Arianna, you had your hand up before the comment. I didn't know if there was something else you wanted to add. Nope. Okay. All right. I think you folks have been comprehensive and have answered everyone's questions, and we are effectively out of time anyway. So I would like to thank the panelists and just encourage all of the attendees, as you're leaving, you will be forwarded to an events survey, and we would very much appreciate you completing that survey when you leave. It helps us to understand how we reached you and how we might provide other services and other talks that are of interest in the future. And again, thank you so much to all of the panelists and to Francesca Fiorentini for helping to organize this panel, the very first in the series. There are 2 more coming in April. For those who are interested, we very much look forward to those and to seeing many of the attendees, and perhaps these panelists will join us for those as well. Thank you, everyone. And I hope you have a lovely evening or a lovely afternoon, depending on where you might be, or morning if you're on the West Coast. So whatever it is that you're doing, I hope that you enjoy it. Thank you very much.
Amy. Thank you, everybody. Thank you to our lady panelists. Thank you, Liza and Corinne, for helping. Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye-bye, everyone.
See you next time. Ciao.